Hello, welcome to Tech Leaders Livestream. I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm a tech leadership trainer and coach at Tech Leaders Launchpad, and this is Tech Leaders Livestream. I started this because when I became a tech leader 15 years ago, there weren't a lot of resources out there for people like me, people who were new to leadership. There weren't the books, they weren't the websites, and they weren't definitely the live streams that exist today. And so I started Tech Leaders Launchpad, the company, and Tech Leaders Livestreams to help people who were in the same situation I was 15 years ago. I want to help you become a better leader. I want to help you learn the things that myself and the people that I share with you learned the hard way through making a lot of mistakes. And it's not good to make a lot of mistakes as a leader because we're making mistakes on other people. Code doesn't care if you fail a test 100 times. Humans care if you experiment on them 100 times. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is share my coaches, my mentors, the people that I learn from with you to help you learn and get better. So with me today, we've got Dan Prager. Dan is with me to talk about embodied leadership and specifically how that applies to things such as burnout and dealing with the challenges that we have in our industry. Dan, you've been on here before, but do you want to refresh people's memory and let them know who you are?
Sure. Thanks for having me back, Andrew. It's good to be back. So my background is in software development and leadership. Nowadays, I work for Everest Engineering, heading up our coaching and learning capability. And I think relevant today, I've got a strong side interest dating back decades in learning and teaching martial arts, which is a very embodied discipline for those who want specifics. Japanese jiu-jitsu, judo, and kung fu are the main ones that I study. But for the purposes of today, I like to do things with my mind and body. And I found that in coaching and facilitating and giving talks, when I brought some of that physicality and embodiment from martial arts, it kind of helped, but I never really meshed them together. I'm a bit further along and nowadays, and suggested to Andrew it might be a good topic to talk about and see if it resonates with his audience.
Yeah, I think it's a really fun thing to talk about and not something a lot of people talk about. And we are, despite the weather today in Melbourne, we are slowly getting towards Christmas. And so I was thinking, as we all wind down for the year, as we all kind of spend some time reflecting on what's come before us and what we've got to do in the coming months and the period after the break over Christmas and the New Year, I thought it would be a great topic to kind of finish the year off and in some ways have a bit of a chill chat, just the two of us, rather than the more kind of structured conversation with a panel, and we can just have a talk about this topic. Please, audience, please share your questions, comments, and suggestions in the chat, and we'll talk about them as well, because I don't want us to talk at you for 60 minutes. I want you to be part of the conversation. I want you to be part of the dialogue. And the best way to do that is to talk to us. Dan and I will be discussing your comments as well as the general topic of embodied leadership. Shall we start off then with what is embodied leadership?
Yeah, I guess we could break it down into what is embodiment and how might it be relevant to leadership. For now, at least, we're all embodied beings. We're not heads on sticks. The body is more than a brain taxi for most of us. Some of you might like to be uploaded to the cloud. That ain't happening just yet. So embodiment is physical experience. So we have physical feelings. They tie in with our cognitive thoughts. Some people will go mind, heart, below the camera, gut. We associate often gut with intuition and heart with emotions. And as leaders, we're more than talking cognitive creatures. People pay attention to how we hold ourselves, how we relate, how we communicate. And we also feel internally, both physically and emotionally, for what happens around us. So I guess I'd say embodied leadership is paying attention to the body as well as the mind in our practice of leadership as a very broad entree to the area.
Yeah, I think it can be so easy to forget that sometimes, like especially in our jobs where a lot of what we're doing is cognitive work and we get lost in our thoughts. And part of what we seek as knowledge workers is this idea of flow and kind of disconnecting from the world around you, including sometimes your physical self. That's kind of seen as this ultimate goal and ultimate desire of especially what software developers want to do: get into flow state and forget about everything else. But you can't do that because you are a biological being still. You are still somebody who has a physicality to them.
Yeah, it's super interesting bringing up flow. We can talk half the time or more on flow. Sometimes people talk about it as, in the sports context, as being in the zone. And of course, sports, embodied, walking in nature, embodied. Maybe you've got, and if people want to put in the chat where they go to have those kinds of flow experiences outside of oneness with the code or that cognitive experience, that might be interesting. I love spending time walking in nature or looking out into the vista of by the sea or up in the mountains. These are very embodied experiences which connect with flow. At the same time, having been a developer and then occasionally still coding for fun, I kind of get that flow. That's another flow sense. I do want to mention though, and maybe we can get into the sort of the flip side of it. Ron Jeffries, who some of the older listeners may have heard to, one of the parents of extreme programming. I heard a bit of an interview with him lately where he talked about what happens when he's coding and it's not working and he's struggling and he starts getting headache and tension pain. And he said, if I listened to my body, I would just do anything and continuing. So his lesson, and he's been doing this even longer than me, is to ignore those signals, which I think is probably not the best strategy, and just push through the pain. For me, if I get that kind of reaction, I'd be like, maybe it's time to have a break. Maybe what I'm doing isn't working. Maybe I need to go for a walk or something and let the background processes, the intuition, the creative thinking kick in, because at the moment I'm metaphorically belting my head against a brick wall.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. Like I know I get this sense that I can't solve this problem without walking away from my computer screen and going and doing something else. Like I have a very visceral sense in myself when it's that sort of problem, and I've got to go for a walk. And what's interesting with me is I have to be listening to something when I'm doing those thinking walks. So I have podcasts that I kind of like, but kind of don't really care that much about. and I put them on as background noise when I'm doing one of my thinking walks, because otherwise I can't focus my brain. And I go out, I do one of these thinking walks, and inevitably I solve the problem after 20, 30 minutes.
It's super interesting. And I think there's probably research out there, but I'm more into my own experiential research of a lot of the most creative ideas will come when walking or in the shower, or, it's those intuitive leaps, if you like. Just because we're doing the semi-random chat thing, it always interests me, especially in this era of when people are in the office, even going back to the before times open plan. Some people will have music on while they're coding and writing. I could never do that because I'd just be away with the fairies. But again, it's another thing of some people who are just pushing away irrelevant background noise. Often if you work with people who are more on the design space or doing workshops, they'll have a bit of music on to stimulate the creativity, but there is diversity in how people function best. And so I think it's really cool that you've sort of further evolved the going for a walk to, you know, having the playlist or the music or podcasts, which will help with your creative or unblocking processes.
Yeah, it's something I've been really conscious of, because I used to do what Ron Jeffries did of just trying to push through it, and it wasn't working for me. All right, let's get back to the topic of embodiment and embodied leadership. So, what the viewers won't know is that you and I actually did an embodied coaching session. So in preparation for this live stream, Dan said to me, if we're going to talk about this, why don't I take you through a coaching session where he used the concepts of embodiment to help me deal with some issues that I was having and some decisions I had to make. And so we basically had it's probably a 30-40 minute coaching session where we went through some of these concepts. And from doing that, it became really clear to me that it was valuable for me. There were certain elements of it that I found hugely useful in coming up with the answers to the problems that I had. But it also became clear to me that this probably isn't for everybody. You had me standing up with the camera pointed at me, holding myself in some quite unusual positions as you kind of talked me through this idea of holding myself in place and trying to listen to what my body was telling me. And I can imagine that, you know, you and I have a huge amount of trust with each other. We've known each other for years, you know, and this was quite a private session, because where I was in a room where nobody else could see, but I can imagine that this must be quite a polarizing kind of concept of trying to do embodiment in coaching.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can have some fun with it to try and get the message across, but I don't think everyone takes to it. And if you want to make fun of it, just you can diss it as this is like interpretive dance as a form of coaching, and there is validity to that, but maybe there is something to interpretive dance, which is you know, sort of a avant-garde, way out there kind of thing. So I think, you know, my personal challenge in this session, and hopefully Andrew will help by putting the hard as well as the friendly questions, is to try and get some of that across. So you may have noticed that Andrew and I have been making gestures, like before you're saying you had me do this stuff. Some of you may be familiar with, I think, the Amy Cuddy stuff, the power postures. So to try and, you know, you're going to go and do a job interview or something, or better get up and demonstrate, and she suggests you go and with confidence, probably not in front of the person who's interviewing you, but as a kind of a preparatory exercise, you know. And then the fact is, we're embodying the whole time, you know. When we gesticulate or we change our speaking, we may not be that conscious of it. And so this is a little bit like getting into advanced hackery around an outside-in connection between, if I take certain postures, or an inside-out connection, if I think certain ways, it can help. So, for example, there's the Amy Cuddy thing of the power posture. Another thing that I've seen, well, this is the core of how I do it, is if you smile or stick a pencil in your mouth, you know, you feel a bit happier in the sort of the reverse direction from if you're feeling happy, you might smile or laugh or what have you. Now that can feel artificial.
It's the two-way feedback loop.
Yeah, but and like on the negative side, like the Ron Jeffries story, and I think Andrew, on World Mental Health Day, you did something very courageous and vulnerable and shared a story of getting like migraine-like headaches while driving, and listening to that signal that your body's telling you, maybe I need to change some things. that's one direction. Maybe when you're in a flow state, even with the code, your body is relaxing and becoming a bit more optimal. So when we did we did the coaching sessions, if I was doing a coaching session in a more conventional way, I might ask questions like, what do you really want? And just to put, Andrew can do this with me or not, I said, so, and that will provoke a certain amount of thinking. And then I got him to do it with a couple of, I'll call it postural support, to go like this, lean back. And for many people, this kind of posture connotes, feeling, hey, where's that big picture thinking? What are my ideals? Right? Coming from above. Maybe that gives a different, and your arms get tired with that one. Maybe that gives a different spin on it as you feel your arms getting tight, as you stretch out and trying to get that feeling of space. Maybe like you're looking out over the sea from a cliff top. And then I asked the same question again. What do you really want in your heart of hearts? But this time I got Andrew to sort of give himself a little bit of a cuddle and sink back, a kind of a bit like a fetal position.
A fetal position, yeah.
What do you really want in your heart of hearts, right? Sort of, which can for some people be a bit of a cue to what's the more emotive connection. And so that these are examples of engaging the mind with the question and the body together. Another approach, which I would do in a more extended coaching session, is to not only discuss a challenging situation. Maybe often a coachee will come along with, especially in leadership, with, I did A, B, and C, and it was a disaster, and I want to learn the lessons, and we can just talk about it, and I can hold space. Now I'm gesticulating or holding space for people, and so we can talk about it. And that's going to engage a very cognitive layer of what happened, what lessons are to be drawn, what have you. Or we can engage some embodiment and maybe do, remember I said interpretive dance, use some postures which capture some of the physical feeling that went on in this situation, which was often, just trying to think of an example, has a physical component, like a presentation that didn't quite go so well. I've had stories of the presentation in a company where the new powerful boss came along, and the coachee hadn't, in hindsight, should have talked it through with them beforehand, but felt they had so much, standing within the organisation that they could put out a strategy which turned out to not be aligned with the new boss. And so what had happened there was, from a cognitive point of view, they'd missed a step. But at an interpersonal and embodied point of view, they hadn't connected with that person and got their perspectives. And, well, you can't turn back the past, but you can certainly learn from these lessons, from experience. And then maybe reprocess it by acting out, not just talking about what I should have done instead. And then maybe there'll be more learning, and perhaps even you'll feel better about whatever the unpleasantness was. I hope that gives a bit of the flavour, the territory.
I think it does. From the point of view of somebody who experienced it for the first time, I think that the two things that I found the most valuable, or could see people getting value from, is sometimes we know we want something, but we don't know why we want it. And sometimes we don't know what we want truly under the hood. And I think that idea of trying to kind of listen to the body and what the body is telling you, what you feel drawn towards physically, I see can be a really great way of tapping into that kind of subconscious desire of what do I want and why do I want it. I can see that being useful. Sorry, go on.
No. Keep going.
I think,
What else?
I think there's a little bit of delay, so apologies, Dan. You go, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, so there's that sort of, I'll use some terms of art here, interoception, feeling inwards, and exteroception, feeling outwards. And well, I think that covers most of the world. There's a few interesting polarities we can talk about. But since you brought this one up, there's how am I feeling? Like if you've got that migraine headache or the backache or the sweatiness in the hands before giving a presentation, that's, you know, your body or your body mind trying to tell you something, you know, and it's not like there's a chart which says exactly what it is, but it's probably worth listening to. And then there's the more outward oriented thing of, especially if you're in a workshop or a meeting, sort of being aware of the vibe of the room and reading the room, holding space for other people, which come into some of these various supportive forms of leadership, notably facilitation. You know, we used to joke about some people, they walk around and they're very inwardly directed, as if there's a paper bag over their head. As a leader, I don't think you can afford to do that. So there's a sort of a sensing of what's going on. There's projecting action, and then there's listening to the small voice inside as well. And I think the embodiment is a real tool. But yeah, and you may find that you're better at one or the other, or you might be like miscalibrated. I know for me, a miscalibration that I have is I don't have a very good poker face. So I can become, no, as a coach, I'm holding space, I'll be fine. But if I'm in a meeting where I'm in a more of a representational leadership capacity, I don't like what someone's saying, I can make it very clear with a very frowny face, and people who are keyed in are going to read that, and then awkward conversations ensue. But I think it's part of that.
The opposite of that, the opposite of that could also be bad. You know, I once worked with somebody, and she always had a very stern expression on her face, whether or not she liked what was going on, and it was really difficult to read her as well, and to know if she was liking something or not liking something. So both sides of that are bad. Either, I guess, both extremes.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, one accessible area is, and great for leaders, is to train in listening skills. And probably the best known is active listening. And in active listening, and Andrew is demoing it very well now, there'll be nodding, there'll be helpful questions, and if the interruptions, they'll be supportive or clarifying and so forth. And it'll tend to be a more positive effect. And that's excellent. If everyone was skilled at active listening, the world would be a far better place. However, I'm also a bit of a fan of generative listening, which is a bit more toned down and neutral, because the risk is that if you're looking for approval as the speaker, then you may misinterpret the active listening of, Andrew thinks this is a great idea and we should all go and do leadership embodiment. Whereas if I've got to work through a problem, and as a leader, you don't want to be solving the problems for all your people. You want to hold a space for them. And so a bit more neutrality, toning it down, will help give the person a bit more space to work through things themselves. And then at a particular point, they might go, can you give me some guidance or what have you? And then sure, but you don't have to be super encouraging the whole time. And of course, with the frowny face or the concerned look, you're probably going to kill a lot of that anyway. So yeah, generative listening which has, again, there's an embodied component probably to most things, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to mention something else that I kind of observed during our coaching session, and I mentioned this to you at the time. So, for those of you who don't know, I am on the autistic spectrum. I'm a diagnosed what used to be called Asperger's, now high functioning autism. And one of the problems that I used to have as a young child into a late teenager was recognizing facial expressions. So I was terrible at recognizing people's facial expressions and understanding what they were thinking. What that meant was I had to learn those skills cognitively as opposed to instinctually. So I now can recognize facial expressions. I now have a pretty good understanding of what the other person is thinking or feeling if they're able to express it. However, it's a cognitive act for me, not an instinctual act. What that means is, like, say for example, when you and I are talking, just casually, there's always a background thread in my mind that is taking up a certain amount of my processing power to do that act. And when we did some of the embodied coaching, and I found it really helpful to close my eyes and to shut out all of the stimuli and just listen to my body, because that's not something that I do often, because I always have to have this background thread of looking at the other person. And so just that act of closing my eyes, I suddenly found myself more able to understand myself, because I was able to devote all of my processing capacity to myself.
Beautiful. Yeah, and in our profession, there is a lot of neurodiversity around on various spectra. I think there's a couple of things to bring in there. So one is the whole, maybe it gets too much airplay, but maybe not enough, the psychological safety, that you felt safe enough to close your eyes, that you didn't have to be looking at me for approval, harking back to what we were just talking about. But on to just close your eyes, sort of search inside. People who've done some forms of meditation may be familiar with body scan. We think of meditation as a cognitive activity, but often there's focus on breath, on scanning the body and so forth. Again, embodied, mind, body, all that palaver. And just to give, I guess, a related anecdote. I quite like things. I don't know how familiar the audience is with unconferences. An unconference is like a conference, but instead of having a lineup of speakers in advance, it's got a schedule, but you sort of crowdsource all the events. And the first one I ever went to, I had so much fun, and it was so stimulating that by halfway through day 2, I felt like I wanted to put a blanket over me, like one of those birds in a cage, not because I was having a bad time, but I'd been overstimulated incredibly. And fortunately, then someone ran a session on the power of silence, and we spent 5 minutes just sitting quietly with each other and then talked about the experience afterwards. So there are these beautiful, again, embodied experiences that, if there is sufficient safety and it's not felt as too weird or unconventional, that we can tap into. At the same time, no one should feel that these postures are things that you should feel pressured into using in work situations where they would be seen as weird or unconventional. Use them in your own time, much as you don't do yoga in the middle of a team meeting, unless it's that kind of team. Yeah. So whatever works, but pay some attention to the organizational or social environment that you find yourself in.
Yeah, but there's definitely, like, these are the extreme embodiment things, which is why you use them in the coaching. But there's just gesticulations and things we do. There's been so many great comments. I just want to go through a few of them before we continue. James, the stretching feels good though after being hunched up. That's a great point as well. Just going for a big stretch sometimes breaks you out of that situation you're in. That's such a great point. I definitely feel it. Sorry, Maria, your name for some reason doesn't come through. StreamYard sometimes does this. LinkedIn needs the same emoji. I think that's when I was talking about my cognitive processing overload. Rachel, thank you. It's something I don't talk a lot about, and there's various reasons why, but I think it does play into a lot of what I try and do. I think one of the main reasons I got into doing this kind of stuff, teaching, coaching, is because I was so bad at it. And the prevalent view 15 years ago when I first started learning this stuff was you were either born good at it or you weren't born good at it. And that's just not the case. And so when I share about my neurodivergence, it's almost often through the lens of doesn't matter that I was born the way that I was born. I can still learn these skills. I can still become good at them. And therefore so can you. And I try and do it through that angle. So when I do talk about it, it's through that. Okay, just going through. Why don't we? You mentioned martial arts, Dan, at the beginning. Can you connect those dots for us between martial arts and embodiment?
Yeah, and I think this applies to anyone who's got some physical practice. I think Shreyas talked about flow in cricket. So it could be sport, could be dance, yoga, singing, playing musical instruments are good examples. For me, I guess my avocational practice is martial arts, which is very much a mind and body activity. There's ritual with it. Ritual is, I guess, another underrated thing. So to take the example of judo, this is, broadly speaking, people throwing each other around safely. And that, of course, can be a very dangerous thing to do. But you will find that if you are flying through the air, people who have done bungee jumping, which I haven't, or leapt out of aeroplanes, which I haven't, probably feel this. There is an amazing experience when you're in free fall. And so this is getting it from maybe a foot or a few feet off the ground and onto soft mats rather than from greater heights. That's another kind of flow trigger. But to do so safely, you need to learn, you need to work collaboratively in the learning, and until you're safe enough, and then you can also get into the competitive side if you want to. So there's this learning, there's embodiment, there's thinking about it. How do I make this work? And there's this fantastic, just to take one of the many things that can come out of martial arts, there's this fantastic, really physical metaphor for resilience. So if you're being thrown or tripped or whatever and you fall and then you get up again, it's like, we have this kind of idea. What's the old saying? Fall down 7 times, get up 8. When you're learning a martial art like that, being thrown isn't failure. It's just part of the engagement, but it might feel a bit like that. So you're learning resilience in an embodied way. Plus, it's fun in both interacting with other people, being physical, learning and improving skills. And, when I was starting out, I used to learn on Friday nights. Who goes to a training class on a Friday night? Well, for me, it was a great time at the very start to sort of clear my head of all the stresses from the week. And then as I was flying through the air, I wouldn't be thinking about what was going on at work or study, but just how do I execute? So it brought me very much into the moment. So learning how to get more of that flow experience, if you like. Then later, as a teacher, I would ask the question, so how have you taken your lessons from martial arts into real life? And most people would say, I've learned to fall, so now I fall off my bike or trip or whatever, and I don't hurt myself badly. But that feels a little bit like just the entry, because there's, there's part of it is, I guess, if we were back in earlier human times, there is this thing of going into fight or flight. There's a threat from the environment, from animals, from the neighboring tribe, and fight, flight, and freeze are all ancestral responses, if you like, to this, which serve a usage. But in our modern era, say when you're challenged by a colleague or a client or a customer or a boss, we can find those same very physical reactions, and we may be getting them a lot. And that doesn't seem to be good for us as humans. So I think some kind of physical practice and learning to flow through what previously might have triggered a freeze reaction, which, to take that judo example, if someone's about to throw you at first, you are likely to, and you don't have the retraining to just sort of go with it, you're likely to freeze up. That's a problem. In a work situation, as a leader, you're challenged, right? Metaphorically, we're now in conflict. And I think everyone has the experience of seeing people who are very skilled at doing that not get triggered and start going, the fight reaction, or just, collapsing and whatever, but more skillfully engaging. A long answer, but I hope it gives some evocation.
I like that. Yeah, I like that, kind of bringing it into conflict in the workplace, because that's, when you're thinking about those times where there's a very direct, I guess, biological imperative in the workplace. I think the conflict and the fight or flight is a really, really good example of that. When I do training courses about it, I try and not use fight or flight because it's very extreme language. But so the language that I use is forcing dialogue and withdrawing dialogue. As like, if you're fighting with somebody, what you're basically doing is you're forcing words, you're forcing your point of view into the conversation. And if you're in that flight mental state, you're kind of withdrawing your dialogue, you're withdrawing from the conversation. And I use those because I don't want people to think that we're talking about physical conflict, but sometimes it can get there. We wish it didn't, but sometimes humans can do that.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm reminded of a time where I was coaching into an organisation that will remain nameless, and there was a very a bodybuilder type guy who was also that very hypermasculine, forceful manager. And I was in to facilitate a session, and he was it was like real alpha gorilla behavior. And I had some suspicion that something like this might happen. And just to give another example of physicality, I said to the fellow, right, time out. Can we just pop out and have a little word? And so I wasn't fighting, I wasn't running away. What I was trying to do is just de-escalate. The physicality helped. This is the T for those who don't. I think it's a basketball. And then I was able to take him out. Right, he's much safer if it's just one-on-one. And I was saying, how do you think it's going in there? What do you look? Et cetera, et cetera. Trying to remind him that this was a cooperative activity, which feels more like the higher realms of human behaviour and leadership than dropping down into this more antagonistic, fight-ish one. But the leadership skill there that I used was being able to recognise where we were and not go into fight or flight, but to find another way. And again, the embodiment helped. So yeah, I mean, it sounds, there's two levels. There's sort of, it's probably not a bad way. There's the, here's a bunch of little tricks, and then there are, I guess, you can do more systematic study via, taking some training in some embodied discipline.
Mm. Yeah, let's. It's my job as facilitator of these sessions to make sure that people can have actionable takeaways from us having a chat. We've talked about this topic. Let's kind of shift into the point of view of giving people suggestions. Now, you and I, we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, we're not counselors. We're not people who have any kind of professional qualification in this area. So we talk from our own life experience. We talk from what's worked for us. So the stuff that we've been talking about may not work for you if you're watching this. So please bear that in mind. This is not coming from anything other than what we've observed worked for us. Let's kind of tackle the topic first. Like, this is Tech Leaders live stream, where we've got an audience of people who are looked to from within their organization as the culture holders of an organization. The types of things that you do as a leader kind of ripple and reflect throughout your team. Do you want to maybe talk about that for a couple of minutes, and how embodiment is important from that point of view of being that reflection of the culture of the company?
Yeah, sure. I think I break it into two areas. One is working with others, and one is working with yourself. I think what we've covered so far, there's a lot of working with yourself, like closing your eyes, looking inwards, self-regulation, etc. In working with others as a leader, I kind of like the framing of trying to be a multiplier of other people's effectiveness rather than a self-aggrandizing person. So how do you do that? One of the things I think you've probably covered many times before, but it can never be enough, is that transition from individual contributor to team lead. As individual contributors, we're very much rewarded for our expertise and problem-solving capabilities. These don't go away as leaders, but what we don't want to do is become the super problem solver who solves everything for our team or teams, but rather creating a space, mentoring, coaching people to be better problem solvers and better peers, so that they're getting better in their individual function, but also many of them will go on to also support their peers. So then doing peer-to-peer leadership, and some of whom will be the next generation of leaders, so that you can then go on and do different things or whatever. So, one of the embodiment tricks that I'll come in a short session, I think it's best to just talk about a few moves. Going back to the active listening and generative listening, one of the things that I think most technical people will do when someone is telling them about a problem they're trying to figure out is they'll start trying to find solutions. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe there's some co-creation. But what can be immensely helpful is to just hold space for the other person to either be mildly encouraging or a bit neutral. And to overcome the desire to solve the problem or to plan what I'm going to say next, I will use a little mantra without speaking it, when I catch myself planning my response of, I wonder what they're going to say next, to re-engage my curiosity. There's a physical gesture where I sort of, sorry, it's a bit trying to adjust the screen, where I just sort of, this is called a bridge posture, where I sort of lean forward like this. I want that mental feeling of, I'm part of a bridge where I'm here to listen to you and to help you do your best thinking. If I'm facilitating a workshop or a meeting, I'll be trying to sort of sense what's the vibe, looking around, having a fairly open posture, noticing who's being talked over or who hasn't had a say yet, and then maybe I'll reach out and say, Andrew, we haven't had much from you. What are your thoughts? So in that interpersonal thing, in the one-on-ones, it's like being very present and listening. The 2 ears, 1 mouth. We have to give you some idea of what the ratio you should be doing, and then holding space more broadly in groups is good, I think. What about you, Andrew? I mean, this is you do teach some aspects of embodiment in your curricula. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, like the stuff that I tend to focus on is the intra stuff for yourself, but also how that kind of has implications for your team. So a big thing that I teach is dealing with overwhelm and stress management, because it's something that I struggled a lot with. But there's two angles to look at that from, or I guess three angles, because there's dealing with it yourself, and how do you stop yourself becoming overwhelmed and stressed? How do you recognize it? But then there's also how that gives permission for the team to do that or not do that. So, as a leader, the things we do are implicit permission for our teams to do, and it's really easy to forget that. But I once a year or so ago, I caught COVID, and we were going through some really, really tough times at work. We were going through a reorganization, and we were completely redefining the structure of the business. And I had COVID, and I had huge brain fog, and I was really, really struggling to compute and to think about what was going on. And I suddenly realized that not only was I not going to be able to give my best to this really tricky time the company was going through because I couldn't think straight, but I was also, by pushing through and trying to do this with the best of intentions, I wanted to make sure my team felt looked after and felt that they had the best outcome possible from what was happening. I was basically implicitly saying to my team, if you get COVID and you've got a stressful time, you've got to work through that as well. Because no matter what I say, my actions are different to my words. And by doing what I was doing, I was having a disconnect between my words and my actions. And people listen to your actions more than they listen to your words. And so that's another important element is, yes, stress management and dealing and understanding yourself and dealing with what's happening and dealing with burnout is important for you. But as a leader, if you don't do that, you're basically giving implicit permission for your team to not do it as well and not deal with it. And so there's this element of putting your own mask on first, which is crucially important, but also showing that it's important to put your own mask on first and demonstrating that behavior.
Yeah, it's a real culture building dynamic there, for sure.
Yeah.
One of the questions we've got is down the bottom is, would you recommend embodied leadership be a module all engineering leaders should be given by their companies?
Yeah. I mean, my personal opinion is that this is something people should think about and people should talk about. And I'm obviously, as a training company, I have a bias towards training, so I'm never going to say no to delivering training that I think should be useful. But I think this is a great example of where training isn't enough in this type of stuff. Like there's if you think about the way people learn, there's knowledge, information, skill sets on one side, there's mindsets, the way you think about the situation, and then there's practice. And you can learn some stuff quite cognitively, and you can have the mindsets to be effective with it. But I think embodied leadership is something that is really you really need to practice and do, and you can't learn it theoretically.
Yeah. I think it should be given by all companies. I think it's like anything. I mean, speaking personally, I would love to do that, to give that training to many, many companies. But I think my experience and Andrew's experience is it's not for everyone. I think, Andrew, you told me the other day that it was like when you do something which touches into this area, you get about a 50-50 split. Yeah. I reckon if 50% of people signed on because they were embodiment curious and then did a bit of the follow-up, did some of the follow-up practice and found other like-minded people, that would be hugely beneficial to the people, their teams, and their companies. So, but I think it's like, you know, maybe it will be, embodiment will be the next wave after the mindfulness spike that we're seeing. In fact, they're not completely. There is definite overlap between them. So, but I think at the moment it's still, for the moment, it's a little bit fringe, but there's stuff out there. I'll just put the name of, you can. Not everyone has to go and learn martial arts. So Uzazu was what I ended up doing some deeper studying in. It comes from a sort of an overlap between music, choreography, dance, and schools of meditation. I can thank COVID because it really wasn't taught here, but was made available online during the lockdowns. And it's a made-up word. It's not a culturally appropriated word. It is actually a flow in itself, where the U is this kind of fetal position, which is known as sponge in the Uzazu nomenclature, and Ah is the most collaboratively biggest. Feel like you're kind of doing some rave type dance. So it's a flow from U being maximally contracted to Ah, and then back to U again. So yeah, you can go and if you Google that, you can find out a bit about one approach, and I landed on that because I was looking for something that was modular, that specifically wasn't martial arts based, and I quite like that one, and have some qualification to coach in it. We've got another question, Andrew.
Yeah, so we're rapidly approaching time, so I think this is probably the last question. Question from Rachel: any thoughts on how embodied leadership might work in in-house teams versus consulting teams, which are often temporary / project based? I'll throw it to you first, Dan.
Yeah, in our company, I have coached a few people on Uzazu, especially leaders, using this and other modalities. So, and we are a consulting company. So, I think with the longer lived teams, if you get a few people on board with it, you can start to get a bit of a language and boost psychological safety and interchange and collaboration. I think with consulting teams or more temporary teams, it's sort of like, in both cases, this is how long have you got them and how widespread is the understanding. I think for consulting, I think these kinds of skills, and especially if you're doing facilitation, working with stakeholders, influencing in those higher level consulting skills, it's very valuable, but it has to be a bit more specific. A bit, you know, a generation ago, people might have talked about, you know, your posture and how you read body language and the like, which is a kind of an external version of this. It doesn't touch on what Andrew particularly emphasized, the internal self-regulation. But I think those are 2 points of entry: building up psychological safety in your longer-lived teams for better collaboration, and for the shorter-lived ones, tuning up your consulting skills and your presence and your ability to connect and collaborate with people who you haven't known for very long in what can be challenging situations. Embodiment can add an extra layer. And just to give a super short example of it, as you learn these kinds of things, like I was talking about this is mesh, this is like collaboration, but if you go rah, 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 that's like an overwhelmed mesh. And I remember just coaching someone who started doing that gesticulation spontaneously in describing her challenge in facilitating teams that had become all overwhelming. And so I was able to say, hey, did you notice doing that? You know, that, just try this on for size. That can mean that you've just sort of lost it. It's become a bit too much. And what you might try just metaphorically is slowing it down, grounding, you're sinking a bit more down into the ground. The next time you facilitate, taking a few breaths, etc. So when you can do that and call it out, it's a bit like empathy on steroids. People are like, oh yeah, you know exactly how I feel. So yeah, so I do. Yes, I do see scope for it. Did I use all the time?
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Yeah, that idea of kind of being conscious of yourself as well, and trying to be aware of it. I think the only other thing I'd add to what you said, Dan, is I'm a really big fan of building communities of practice at consultancy. So in my career, I've run many consultancies, and one thing that I like to do in them is build communities of practice around particular topics. Like, we're familiar with the idea of guilds and chapters in reference to technology-based skill sets. So, we're familiar with having a cloud and a front end and a mobile chapter or guild. But what we don't often do in consultancies, and I'm a really big fan of, is having communities of practice around other things, these kind of people skills, these human skills, these core skills. And so, for example, I always like to bring in a client management community of practice, or a project leadership community of practice. That's nothing to do with what job title somebody has, but more to do with the type of function that they perform. And so, even though the project-based teams are maybe not as long-lived as they are in a product company, these roles that you play within those teams are often quite long-lived. And so you can build a pseudo team, which is a community of practice around those concepts. And those long-lived community of practices, practopodies, allow you to build more psychological safety within them so that you can start doing some of these things. So I love that idea of huge communities of practice within consultancies.
Yeah, I think that's a rather beautiful sentiment to land on. And as we think about working in a more networked way, which is very much what one is doing in that consulting scenario, those communities of practice guilds and so forth form wonderful cross connections within the system, especially if part of what you're doing is some transformational work. Really need those. Yeah, lovely.
Definitely. All right. We are at the end of the hour and slightly over, so thank you for staying in that little extra minute. If you did do so, thank you very much, Dan, for this discussion. Always great to have you on here. I love our chats, whether they're on live stream, over a beer, or whatever. So thank you for coming along. This is our last live stream for the year. We don't have any more in December. We're going to take a little bit of a break over Christmas. We're going to come back at the end of January. I've got a live stream with charity majors on communication when trust is low in a team, which is a great kind of follow-on for this topic. Going to have Charity on, talk about the blog post you put together, what inspired her to create that blog post, and we're hopefully going to get a bunch of great actionable tips for all of you. So thank you very much for coming along to the Tech Leaders live stream. Thank you again, Dan, and I will see you all in the new year. Goodbye.
Thank you.